Let's learn this week's Parsha with our commentator of the year, Parshan Hashanah Rashi. And I'll begin with chapter 6, verses 11 and 12 of Genesis. We're told just before that God has noticed Noah, this righteous soul in his generation, the tzaddik of his time. And then the camera pans out and we see and we're given information about the situation going on down there on earth, according to God's perspective. V'tishachet ha'aretz lifnei ha'elohim, v'timalei ha'aretz chamas. And when we study with Rashi, we like to think back to other Rashis we've learned, other comments that Rashi has made. And if we see the name Elohim, as we highlighted in the study of Parshat Bereshit, the first Torah portion of the year, the name Elohim suggests that we relate to God's midat hadin, God's aspect of strict justice, the dayan ha'aretz, the judge of the world. And so God here is sitting and needs to judge the world. Why? Because we have the world had become corrupt. And not just once did the word corruption get used within verses 11 and 12. But listen to verse 12. 2 times more will have the root shin chet tav. And thusly, I believe that stirs Rashi, especially when a root is used 3 times within a couple of verses. Rashi just goes towards that root and wants to explicate it and expand our understanding, not to limit entirely our own conception of what corruption of the earth is about, but Rashi will further define it. So again, verse 11 will say, V'tishachet ha'aretz, the earth had become corrupt. And verse 12, Vayar Elohim, that same name of God, Elohim saw that V'hine nishchata, it was corrupt. It had been corrupted. Ki hishchit kol basar et darko ala haaretz. And who was the destroyer? Who was the corrupter? It was flesh and blood. It was human beings who destroyed their way on the earth. But maybe kol basar doesn't just include people of flesh and blood. Maybe it's all flesh and blood that included the animals as well. And thusly we see here a justification, and Rashi is going to highlight that as well, to say, here's why only a few were saved on the ark. Because we always have that question. What did they do? What did they do? What did the animals do to deserve this? So, first entry of Rashi's, V'tishachet, the earth had become corrupt. Rashi will say it's Lashon Erva. It's that the earth and all the inhabitants had corrupted their relationships. Sexual immorality was rampant. And 2, added dimension, the avodah zarah, and idolatry was running rampant as well. So you have 2 types of shin chet tav, perhaps for the first 2 mentions of the root before verse 12's ki hishchit kol basar, on which Rashi also makes a comment, because even now Rashi is going to tell you who was at fault. Even the animals had a role in it, not just the human beings. Afilu behema chaya va'of nizkakin l'she'enan minan. Not only had the human beings engaged in immoral sexual relations, sex crimes, crimes against one another's body, and idolatry, which is, of course, an absolute negation of God's presence and God, the maker of all order. But even animals broke the boundaries, corrupted the order of creation, and had relations with those which were not of their species. This is what Rashi brings forward in his examination of these two verses. One last comment that we'll read is about what the earth was really filled with. It had been corrupted and thusly filled with what, according to the text? Vatimalei ha'aretz Hamas. Hamas. We're familiar with that term because of the terrorist organization. And the fear that they stoke and the murder that they're ready to commit. But that's not the meaning of Hamas here, Rashi will explain. What does Hamas really mean? That beyond sexual immorality and the idolatry that he mentioned before with the root shin chet tav, that Hamas, as another element of the corruption of all humanity, Hamas is gazel or gezel. The word Hamas means robbery. And I'll tell you, Shene'emar, as it said, Umin ha-Hamas asher bechapehem, and from the robbery which was in their palms, as it says in the book of Jonah, in chapter 3, verse 8. In their palms means over there that they had stolen goods in their possession. So Rashi learns from one book and the use of a word to another place in the Tanakh, here in the Torah, and tells you that the world was filled not only with sexual immorality, not only with idolatry, but also with robbery. The Midrash that he might be basing himself on explains in Bereshit Rabbah that many of the human beings couldn't be blamed for direct sexual crimes or even idolatry, but they were so unethical and immoral that when they went to the marketplace and they saw the vendors with bags full of lentils, that each of them would just scoop up enough to potentially place in their stew or grind down and make a little flour. But they thought they were taking only just a little. What's taking a little? What's stealing a little out of this vendor's bag? And of course, if everybody thinks that he or she is only taking one of the plums in the box in the fruit stand, of course, that leaves the seller with none. And that's the kind of everyday immorality that needs to be put in check, as much as the more corrupt and destructive crimes or idolatry that was being practiced. Thankfully, God capacitated Noah. Noah was inspired to respond to the great flood that would come and the need for resetting the earth and the order of creation. So Rashi explains why Noah the Tzaddik was needed and why he had to spend all that time and energy building the ark he did and caring for those creatures. Shabbat Shalom.